Listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas, gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is May the 21st, 141st day of the year. Just 224 days remain to the year's old with holidays and observances. It's World Mediation Day. World Meditation Day. Duh, can't read my own handwriting. National Talk Like Yoda Day, and a National Tea Day. World Day of Cultural Diversity. National Eat More Fruit and Vegetables Day. It's the Firewalking Festival, where you take off your shoes and go hot foot to cause hot colds. World Product Day. Cool Sword Day. National Waitstaff Day. National Memo Day. I need a patch for that day. And a National Customer Support Day. National Juice Slush Day. Emergency Medical Services for Children Day. End of the world. This interesting theory had people on the edge. But the day has come and we're still here. National Strawberry and Cream Day. National Memory Day. National American Red Cross Founders Day. Turn Beauty Inside Out Day. The National Heritage Breeds Day. Can Swim Festival, which ends Saturday. Be Nice to Nettles Week. Dementia Action Week. And National EMS Week. Well, let's see what's in the news. House speakers reached a tentative salt cap agreement with the blue state Republicans. Maine Representative Laurel Libby opens up on fighting civil rights Supreme Court case with a trans athlete battle. I don't know what the fascination is about having men who pretend to be women in women's sports, but apparently to a lot of Democrats that is so important. Well, there's a new look. And someone says one of Biden's aides intimidated a reporter investigating Biden's mental decline, gave him a tacit threat. Well, now a whole judge is going to exclude evidence that was leaked in the Brian Kohlberg case. Surveillance video and cell data viewed on TV could be barred from the murder case. Remember, judges are God's anointed. Whatever they say goes. Well, a top Democrat's COVID testimony is going to get him in trouble with the DOJ. Andrew Cuomo is being investigated for allegedly lying about COVID decisions. Remember, Cuomo was governor of New York. Cassie Ventura's 2011 email to her mother about Diddy's alleged blackmail has been read in court. A special agent involved in Diddy's Miami home raid is testifying in a sex trafficking trial. The fifth of the 10 escaped New Orleans inmates has been recaptured. They're still trying to figure out if there were people inside the jail that helped them do it. Virginia Democratic Representative Jerry Conley dead at 75 after a cancer battle. In the Great Gut Field, a lot of illegal immigrants are self-deporting. The last I heard, they were being offered $1,000 a piece if they'd just get on the plane and go home. Nike is still refusing to talk about whether or not they funded a trans youth study. House is nearing a vote on a debt ceiling bill as Speaker Johnson aims for pre-Memorial Day deals. Democrats falter as polls show voters want solutions, not anti-Trump rhetoric. And, I mean, it has gotten so silly. Schumer even blamed President Trump for the Mexican ship hitting the Brooklyn Bridge. When you run out of things to say, blame Trump. Now, how a high school student has turned out to be a 24-year-old Venezuelan man who posed as a teen to enroll in an Ohio high school. Legal immigrant Anthony Nebrado Sierra, charged with forgery after enrolling at Perrysburg High School as a 16-year-old student. He's being held on a $50,000 bond. Perrysburg Police Department said it was contacted by the local schools about possible fraudulent activity involving one of its students. It was a preliminary investigation, and then a fraud case was established and handed over to the department's detectives for further investigation. Harvard students and faculty react to President Trump's probe into their admissions policies. Apparently, they have an anti-white admissions policy. Cracker Barrel's responding to a critic as the restaurant chain defends its modern makeover. Cracker Barrel used to be my favorite restaurant. Last time I went, they had everybody packed cheek by jowl to the point that I wound up with pneumonia from somebody who was ill, who was almost sitting on top of our table. Well, let's see, an ancient obelisk that has been moved to Paris. They found hidden propaganda of biblical pharaoh. A legal immigrant was involved in a crash that killed a woman, Ecuadorian. The county refused to accept an ICE detainer. They were going to let him go because he had such a poor upbringing, don't you know? But ICE captured him. He apparently was 3 sheets to the wind when he crashed into the woman and killed her. Well, CNN is now having to answer questions about being complicit in a cover-up of Biden's failing health. According to, even though Jake Tapper now says he's the one that revealed it all, he was one of the main forces that kept everything under wraps about how badly Biden's mental faculties had become. And MSNBC's Jill Scarborough has also been confronted regarding his statements that when he had met with Biden, it was the best Biden ever, even though everybody else said he was failing badly. Democrats joined forces to cover up just how bad a shape President Biden was in. Well, Norm from Cheers died in his sleep. He was 75 years old. It's now come out TSA was watching Tulsi Gabbard on flights under President Biden. She was evil. She was a conservative. Can't trust those conservatives, you know. All right. Well, yesterday we were talking about the unexplained death of Amy Eskridge, a UFO researcher. She was 34 years old. She's found dead from a gunshot wound. And of course, the powers that be assure you that she did it herself and there's nothing to see. Everybody move along here. Well, there is a individual by the name of, what is his name? Oh, Frank Milburn. He says she was being tracked and followed leading up to her alleged suicide. Prior to her death, she'd made comments about how she believed her car had been tampered with. And a lot of folks who get into the UFO field, depending on your point of view, are either paranoid or are being followed and harassed. Another UFO whistleblower named Phil Snyder made similar remarks just prior to his own death. He was convinced at one point somebody had loosened the lug nuts on one of the wheels of his car. He believed they hoped his wheel would come off in traffic and cause him to die in a collision in the middle of the freeway. And Mrs. Etheridge had similar fears that she expressed. Now, she has never fully revealed what her work entailed, but she hinted it involved anti-gravity and the weaponization of free energy, and it was that aspect of her research that had a lot of folks deeply concerned about her. According to Frank Milburn, when she became too opinionated on the subject, the powers that be shut her down. Now, he doesn't believe she committed suicide. He says she was killed by somebody who wanted to silence her. Autopsy could have shed some light on that, but as soon as she was cold, she was cremated. Now, the speed with which her body was cremated led a lot of folks to become even more suspicious, since cremation of a murdered body is akin to destroying the evidence of the murderer. That has raised a lot of questions. You have to say at this point, nobody really knows what happened to her. All you can do is wish your loved ones the best and hope that the killing stops with her. Now let's talk about Dr. John Mack, who I had the opportunity to know. He was a distinguished award-winning author, a psychiatrist, a professor at Harvard. And he was intrigued with alien abductions, not because he necessarily believed it, but because he was fascinated with the minds of the abductees. And he approached the topic not in an effort to prove or disprove the experience, but simply to document the phenomenon, which was affecting a large segment of the population. Now, I went to one of his book signings, where wonder of wonders, the books didn't show up. This was at a Barnes & Noble. And I never saw another author have that issue. I've done book signings there, and my book showed up. Now, he didn't set out to find the smoking gun that would prove or disprove whether or not there are aliens present. He simply wanted to document what the abductees claim to be experiencing. Kind of like a way an anthropologist might document the experiences of Native American shamans. And whether they were real or not, he was fascinated with the stories that the abductees told. Now, it was only after he dug deeper into the subject that he said he became startled with what he found. Startled enough to think that something really was happening to the people he was interviewing. And besides their claims of being abducted by aliens, he was amazed to find there was really nothing all that special about these people. Quite ordinary people, hail from all different backgrounds. They were just like somebody you'd meet on the street. Completely ordinary, everyday people just happened to claim that something rather extraordinary had happened to them. Now, Mack was a trained psychiatrist who knew how to detect signs of deception. He was amazed to find absolutely no hint of deception in most of those he interviewed. He also didn't find any sign of mental illness. In regard to the mental state, he finally concluded the majority of abductees don't appear to be deluded, confabulating, lying, self-dramatizing, or suffering from any clear mental illness. In fact, time and time again, he said he found his subjects to be quite credible, even though the stories they told were rather incredible. Now, not everybody approved of his work, though, and when he published a book on his findings in 1994, Harvard came unglued. They went so far as to launch an internal investigation in an attempt to find wrongdoing between Professor Mack and his patients. This was done so that they could find fault and maybe even grounds for bringing action for malpractice against him. Rather convenient for those wanting to shut him up to have him barred from practicing in the future. But you have to ask yourself why they went to all this effort. Why didn't they just fire him? Well, it wasn't that easy. He was a tenured professor, immune from general dismissal. Someone without tenure could be dismissed for any reason, but for a tenured, esteemed professor like John Mack, a serious violation would have to be discovered. And for that reason, Harvard undertook a witch hunt against him. Well, for his part, he wasn't just going to roll over and accept all this, and he lawyered up and hired a very skilled attorney, Eric McLeish. If anything, just to show he wasn't going to be pushed around. And it was precisely the beauty of Mack as a UFO researcher. He had both the means and the clout to stand up to the bullies in the ivory tower that is Harvard. So when they couldn't find anything to attack him with, that the investigation was finally dropped. Well, he had survived efforts to have him removed and was all the stronger for it. Rather than silencing him, his critics had emboldened him to speak up on the matter even more. So when he couldn't be dropped from Harvard to the normal channels, some think Mack was targeted with other more nefarious means. And as fate would have it, 10 years after Harvard dropped their investigation of John Mack on September 27, 2004, he was randomly hit by a truck one night while on a lecture visit to London. Died right there on the spot. Question becomes, was it a random accident? Certainly convenient for those who wanted to shut him up. And as far as I could determine, nobody ever determined who was driving the truck that hit him. Well, from John Mack, let's turn to James Vincent Forrestal. Now, a lot of the folks that we talk about on this topic became critically ill. They died by accidents. But there are instances in which certain government officials have also met with strange ends, all while being immersed in their own part of the UFO conspiracy. In the early morning hours of May 22nd, 1949, one of the most infamous of those government officials met their fate. The bruised and broken corpse of James Vincent Forrestal was found lying on top of a third-floor canopy. He had fallen, at least that's the official report, from a window on the 16th floor from Bethesda Naval Hospital, where he'd been euphemistically staying, but in actuality locked up. He'd been interred there because it was said he had lost all of his mental faculties. He was labeled as a kook, too crazy for the press to even talk about. And if this crazy guy happened to say anything about UFOs, aliens, or even top secret agreements between the government and the aliens, he was said to be laughed at, disbelieved, and immediately sent back to the loony bin. Or at least that's the approach that his handlers wanted everybody to take. When he persisted with this story, at least according to the officialdom, this supposed madman threw himself in the window of his room on the 16th floor. In fact, he was having a mental breakdown wasn't entirely made up, since he did indeed seek help for bouts of depression and anxiety. And some folks have argued that this depression and anxiety stemmed from the secrets regarding UFOs and aliens that he was carrying. Now, some folks have argued that this depression and anxiety stemmed from the secrets he was carrying. He was given counseling and medication to calm him and numb his nerves. But something else seemed to be deeply bothering Secretary Forstall. Essentially, the only thing that might have helped him was maybe to openly speak his mind about what was really bothering, but at least according to the conspiracy theories, doing that would have divulged top secret information about UFOs and alleged alien presence on Earth. Now, if these secrets did exist, it would have certainly been those who would have done everything within their power to prevent him from talking. And for those with an interest in keeping secrets, they probably wouldn't have had any problems with confining a man to a mental hospital. And he might have gone the extra step of committing murder as well. If they thought the deepest, darkest secrets about UFOs were about to be divulged, they just might have killed him and made it look like he jumped out of his room. Certainly wouldn't be the first time that a government intelligence agency engineered the demise of somebody who talked too much about too many secrets. Now, as grim as his end turned out to be, he actually had a life that had a lot of promise. Born in 1892 in Dutchess County, New York, he went to the finest schools, graduated from Princeton, but nobody held that against him. Worked his way up on Wall Street as a banker and investing genius. In fact, by the time he reached middle age, in 1934, he was rich. Married the love of his life, Josephine Ogden, who was a journalist for Vogue magazine. Well, unfortunately, as is the case so often, the marriage went everything he hoped for. And the two had quite a few arguments. He was also plagued with a drinking addiction, and the alcohol likely fueled their frequent bitter feuds. Nevertheless, he was a fast climber in the professional world. In 1940, he made the leap from investment banker to the U.S. government. He became the Undersecretary of the Navy. It took him just a few years to become the Secretary of the Navy. Well, in 1947, he was able to rise to the post of Secretary of Defense under President Truman. That was a big year for Forstall, according to UFO lore. It was a big year for alien contact as well. That was the same year that they had the crash at Roswell. It was alleged by UFO conspiracy theories that Forstall had knowledge of what had actually happened there and its implications for humanity. It's been theorized that he must have wanted to come clean and publicly announced what had been discovered at Roswell. And this, of course, would have gone against the secrecy of the military-industrial complex and would have been prevented. For that reason, folks think he was silenced. They don't believe he jumped from that window at Bethesda. They think he was pushed. And the question becomes, who would have pushed him? Well, it turns out, just prior to his admission to Bethesda, he openly claimed that somebody was following him. And he'd become quite paranoid and spoke about how he had felt some sort of secret agency. He didn't say if it was foreign or domestic, and been keeping track of his every move. And considering his high-level clearance, the notion he might be monitored, or at least followed, sounds reasonable. Even if aliens weren't involved, the fact that this guy did carry valuable state secrets, was acting as if having a nervous breakdown, would likely bring about some form of chaperoning by one of the secret agencies. So according to the old saying, just because he was paranoid didn't mean folks really weren't out to get him. In fact, that's the title of the book I wrote, Even Paranoids Have Enemies. Well, he even had an outside witness to somewhat confirm this state of affairs. Just prior to his admission to the Naval Hospital, a friend and fellow banker, Ferdinand Eberstadt, visited the increasingly paranoid Forstall at his home. Found him sitting in the dark with all the blinds closed and acting as if he was afraid to move, and he barely spoke above a whisper, as if he was afraid somebody'd hear him. When he confided in Eberstadt that it was his belief his house had been mugged and his active being spied on, Eberstadt tried to push back on these claims, convinced that the overworked Forstall was just stressed out and imagining things. But when Forstall motioned for him to go to the windows and look out the blinds, Eberstadt saw a couple of guys dressed in dark clothing that stood on a nearby street corner. Forstall insisted these two folks were part of the group that was actively monitoring him. And again, Eberstadt tried to shrug this off just because he thought it was his friend's overly stressed imagination. But then the doorbell rang. Forstall had one of his hired help answer the door, and that person posed as some sort of solicitor, and after being told Forstall wasn't interested, he left. Now, these things on the surface seemed innocent enough, but Everstock claimed that Forrestal, now apparently quite used to the routine, motioned for him to once again peer through the blinds of the window, and he did. To his shock, he saw that same solicitor walking up to the two suspicious-looking men standing on the street corner. The three of them seemed to be engaged in a lengthy conversation. Well, paranoid or not, it did seem pretty weird to Everstock as well. He wanted to know what was going on. Despite his own better judgment, couldn't help but wonder if Forrestal really was being monitored. Well, Forrestal thought he was being tracked in order to, at the very least, prevent him from somehow becoming compromised. Once again, it was his frayed nerves that plausible credibility to the notion he might have been suicidal and might have simply been so freaked out he jumped out the window. Either in a direct effort to kill himself or even just a paranoid delusional means of trying to get away, but you have to ask yourself, what was he wanting to get away from? Well, the reports of him being a paranoid mess are somewhat at odds with other reports of his condition. Shortly after he first checked into the hospital, just a couple of days prior to his death, he didn't seem to be exhibiting paranoid symptoms at all. It was around this time that he was allegedly observed to be in a rather chipper mood, talking to Rear Admiral Martin Willicuts, who had come to visit him at the Naval Hospital. At this point, Forrestal was, according to the report, so well rested, clean-cut, talkative, and wasn't a deranged mess, as he was later made out to be. A couple of days later, however, he was found launched from the 16th floor, allegedly on a suicidal whim. Said to be clear and lucid on the night prior to his death, even when the staff asked if he needed a sedative. When he was asked, he declined, indicating he was calm enough and rather read himself to sleep rather than rely on a sleeping pill. Later that night and on into the early morning, it was when something terrible happened. According to the official version, he got up, tied one end of a dressing gown cord around the radiator in his room and the other end around his neck and jumped out the window. Well, the dressing gown cord didn't hold, and he slipped out of it, falling to his death 16 floors below. Now, that's the official version of what happened. Now, other theories as to how he met his end have emerged. One of the ironies of all this, regarding of how Forrestal died, was his brother Henry had become so concerned prior to his death, he made plans to drive out to the Naval Hospital and forced the staff to discharge his brother. He even phoned up the staff to let them know his plans ahead of time, and some conspiracy theorists believe this was what triggered intelligence operatives to take action out of fears that Forrestal would get out of the hospital and reveal what he knew. Even more shocking is some later circumstantial evidence that reveals some signs of what could have been a struggle, a scratch mark just outside the window, which would indicate that Forrestal struggled to keep his grip on the windowsill, even as someone else was trying to push him out of it. Well, Henry Forrestal, for one, never for a minute believed his brother committed suicide. He was convinced for the rest of his life his brother had been choked with that cord and then shoved out the window, either already dead or on his way to dying, sent there by unknown assassins who sought to silence him. James Forrestal was certainly a smart man who carried a lot of secrets in his head. Often been asked, was one of those secrets just too heavy for his overburdened conscience? Did he want to disclose to the public what was on his mind? In the 2020s, talk of disclosure has become a commonplace, and several whistleblowers have gone on record. One of these whistleblowers was a guy named David Grush. And he himself was a member of military intelligence, and he stood before Congress, swore to tell the truth, and admitted it was brought to his attention that some people had indeed been killed by members of military intelligence in order to keep certain things quiet regarding the UFO phenomena. And the question becomes, was James Forrestal one of them? Well, according to a memo supposedly uncovered by UFO researcher Timothy Good, who I also had a chance to know, those responsible for Forrestal's death not only admitted they regretted it. Or, according to the memo, the ultimate untimely death of Secretary Forrestal was deemed necessary and regrettable. Well, Timothy Good claimed he was handed a document by a so-called government insider who, out of necessity, had to remain anonymous. And it is an interesting tidbit of information to add to the mystery, but anonymous notes hardly ever hold water as evidence for high-level state-sanctioned murder. So the question becomes, what actually did happen to James Vincent Forrestal? Was he pushed? Did he throw himself out the window? Or did he just fall? Well, only time will tell, and even with time, there have to be some disclosures. Now, let's talk about Jim Keith. In the 1990s, he was a UFO researcher, had a prolific reach into multiple controversial fronts. In 1999, as that decade was drawing to a close, he was quite busy in his latest major investigative bombshell. His last major project didn't have anything at all to do with UFOs or aliens, as far as we know. Actually, it had to do with the 1997 death of Princess Diana. Well, he'd been scouring over all the data he could get together on that topic and become convinced that Princess Diana was pregnant with a child of her boyfriend, Dodi Fayed. And add this to the all the conspiracies revolving around her death. Since some at the time had been suggested the royal family wasn't happy with the idea of Diana, who had divorced her husband and heir to the British throne, Prince Charles, who's now King Charles III, being pregnant with another man's child, especially a Muslim. And since Dodi Fayed happened to be of the Islamic faith, this added further fuel to the conspiracy-minded, suggesting the royal family not only didn't want the ex-wife of Prince Charles to produce children outside the royal family, but they didn't want her to produce a child that would have deep ties to the Islamic world. So was it just a shower of bigoted fear-mongering, or was there something to these conspiracy theories? Whatever the case might have been, Jim Keith wanted to find out. And in 1999, he was knee-deep in research on the topic. His supposed source, in fact, had informed him the British royal family was actually quite upset about Diana's ties to Dodi Fayed and insinuated they were upset enough to actually do something about it. Well, that's quite a conspiracy theory for sure, and as it pertains specifically to UFO conspiracies, Jim Keith had a long history of researching and writing about UFOs and aliens. The latest venture on Princess Diana, in the meantime, would remain a work in progress because shortly after he began the brainstorming phase of producing an adequate narrative on Diana, he took a brief break by attending the famed Burning Man Festival in the Nevada desert. And it was here at Burning Man that he had met an unforeseen and strange end. Now, the Burning Man Festival was a tradition that began on the West Coast in the early 1980s when Larry Harvey and Jerry James set fire to a giant humanoid effigy on San Francisco's Baker Beach and then used that odd spectacle as an excuse to throw a party. Well, that festival has since taken on a life of its own as a kind of art, music, and just plain oddball gathering of people who want to express themselves in a multitude of different ways. Jim Keith, attending 1999's incarnation of the festival out at Black Rock Desert, which is about 120 miles north of Reno, Nevada, was apparently up on a platform talking to people when he slipped and fell. Now, it wasn't a huge height, but it was enough to cause significant and painful injuries. He didn't know how extensive his injuries were at the time and tried his best to shrug it off and literally walked away from what happened. By the time he got back home, though, the pain was terrible enough for him to break down and phone an ambulance. Taken to the medical center in Reno, where an x-ray indicated he'd sustained a severe fracture of his shin bone, and that was the source of all the pain that he was feeling. And it was painful, but it shouldn't have been life-threatening. He was told he'd be put under some anesthesia and his bone would be fixed so it could heal, which sounds fairly simple and actually a straightforward procedure. But something didn't sit right with Keith, though, and he began to exhibit signs of paranoia. His nephew come to visit him just before he's put under general anesthesia in the meantime and bore witness to what ended up being his Uncle Keith's last words. Keith muttered something about how if they put him under, he'd never wake up. And it turns out his words are quite prophetic. Somehow or other, he sustained a blood clot that turned fatal while he was under anesthesia, died on the operating table. Now the question becomes, was this a tragic accident or a planned event to take out a veteran UFO researcher? Some might think it'd be a stretch to consider his death the result of a coordinated hit, but there's one other odd facet of his final days. Just prior to attending Burning Man, it was discovered his computer had been hacked. He complained to an acquaintance of his that his computer had been hacked and all his personal files, including some of the things he'd been researching and writing on, had been taken. Anybody who's researched the subject and spent long hours writing about it, the idea of somebody having all that hard work deleted is enough to cause nightmares. Well, considering as much, it's really no wonder he wanted to go to Burning Man to unwind, but if his computer was hacked, it would also mean that the hackers had some idea of his planned itinerary. So the question becomes, could they have somehow sabotaged the platform he was standing on? It was a far-reaching speculation, of course, but as weird as Keith's story is, it could always get a little weirder. And maybe weirdest of all is the speculation that Burning Man was actually inspired by the ancient pagan practices of the Druids. It was the Druids who infamously burned wicker constructions resembling people. Only thing was, they usually had a live person inside it. It's kind of a burned alive human sacrifice. Now, the Burning Man festival is said to be just an artistic free-for-all, but the tradition of burning a wooden figure does indeed harken back to the Druids of old. Some see an entirely odd series of coincidences, others see a conspiracy. But sometimes the lines blur. Sometimes it's hard to know which view of perception provides a more accurate picture. And the question becomes, was Jim Keith murdered? Well, from Keith, let's turn to the mysterious deaths of Ron Rummel and Phil Snyder. Now, Ron Rummel had served with distinction in the Air Force and eventually became an intelligence officer. Left the subject and began to delve into a secret passion of his own, UFOs. Now, the topic of UFOs, till very recently, was typically too taboo for service members to even talk about in the open. After leaving the service, Mr. Rummel found an outlet for his interest by publishing the so-called Alien Digest in 1991. Shortly after that, he was found dead of what was termed a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Don't you love it, all these UFO-related people who allegedly commit suicide? It appeared a gun had been placed in his mouth before the trigger was pulled. Although determined a suicide, his death did not sit well with those that knew him. They said he didn't seem suicidal at all. In fact, he seemed quite happy and content, even fulfilled. Well, he was happy with his research and excited about his upcoming work in the Alien Digest. Even beyond this strong lack of motive to commit suicide, the most glaring suspicious fact was his supposed suicide note. After further scrutiny was lit by somebody who was left-handed. And that doesn't make much sense because Mr. Rummel, like most of the population, was actually right-handed. Now, I've had a number of people forge my signature. I am left-handed. And usually, when I get the suspected signature looked at, they determined it was written by somebody who was right-handed. Now, another alleged abnormality was the salty smell on Rummel's corpse that it seemed to exude after his death. And no, this isn't to say that this man had binged on salt and vinegar potato chips just prior to shooting himself. Conspiracy theorists allege the salty smell was a key giveaway he had been injected with sodium pentothal, otherwise known as truth serum. The question is, had somebody slipped into his home, drugged him with truth serum, and badgered him for hours with questions and then killed him? Did they put the gun in his mouth and pull the trigger before positioning his body to look as if the wound was self-inflicted? Was the killer both left-handed as well as short-sighted enough to realize that a left-handed suicide note looked suspicious? But that's what conspiracy theorists allege. For them, Mr. Rummel is likely another UFO researcher who had come too close to the truth, so had to be eliminated by those who wish to maintain secrecy and silence at all costs. But now the question becomes, what mysterious secret was Ron Rummel so precariously close to unveiling? Well, at the time of his death, his Alien Digest had only produced 7 complete issues. But in those issues, the topics verged into a rather startling discussion which spoke about the possibility aliens were recycling human body parts, possibly even using human bodies as food. Well, as scary as the whole UFO phenomena can actually be, the notion of people being eaten by aliens takes things to a whole other level. And it's indeed a rare topic of discussion, even in UFO circles. And adding even more weight to the conspiracy theorist arguments, though, is the simple fact that Ron Rummel was friends with another individual who would turn up dead, UFO researcher Phil Snyder. Now, Snyder had an unusual life, and his death was just about as abrupt and unusual as the rest of it. It was January 17, 1996. Phil Snyder was found choked to death with his own catheter, which had been tied around his neck. And if people had found somebody with a gun in their mouth suspicious, the sight of a man strangled by a catheter would raise even more controversy. Now, Snyder, just prior to his death, had become a kind of UFO whistleblower. Interesting thing about Phil Snyder is it was actually the death of his friend and fellow researcher Ron Rummel that inspired him to come forward with what he knew about aliens and UFOs. Now, Snyder came from a technical background and claimed to have worked as a geologist for the U.S. government at top-secret underground bases, many of which date back to World War II. Now, if you know anything at all about the history of the military, there are, in fact, and there still are, secret underground bases that were classified, in many cases above top secret. And part of Snyder's explosive claims regarding the UFO phenomenon was his insistence the U.S. government was working side by side with aliens at these underground bases. Quite specifically, he claimed that U.S. personnel and aliens were working in a top-secret underground biolab in Dulce, New Mexico. Now, I took time and went to Dulce, a very small town in New Mexico. And it's, after spending a couple of days there, there's definitely something going on. I never could get to the bottom of it because I had a limited amount of time. I made some local contacts who gave me information that just did not compute. Now, the claims about the Dulce base seem to intersect with his ideas, the legend that President Eisenhower made a deal with aliens. He talked about what he called the Grenada Treaty, a pact that Eisenhower supposedly entered into with an alien civilization in 1854. He claimed the U.S. personnel and the ETs had an agreement that suddenly broke down in 1879. Snyder claimed that the breaking of this treaty led to a very real confrontation between the two sides, and he claimed he was personally caught up in the crossfire of one of these breakdowns while serving as a contractor at an underground base. He said he witnessed a shootout between aliens and U.S. personnel that resulted in dozens of U.S. operatives being killed along with some of the aliens. Snyder claimed that during that melee, he himself was hit with some sort of energy weapon fired by one of the aliens during the exchange. And if what Snyder says is true, he was not only a survivor, but one who's broken some very serious oaths of secrecy. And if it's true, it wouldn't be surprising if people will try to eliminate the source of this unmitigated leak. Snyder himself often made remarks about how he might turn up dead for speaking out, but it was a risk he said he was willing to take. He even spoke of instances in which he thought efforts had already been made to take his life. One spoke about finding lug nuts loose on one of the front wheels of his car. Thought maybe some operative had executed this maneuver in the hopes he'd drive down a highway, have the wheel fall off, which would send him careening to his death. He also pointed to the death of his good friend Ron Rummel as an indication of what might happen to him. Having said that, if Snyder really did take his own life, he did so with the full knowledge he'd be further inflaming his previous sentiments. So either Phil Snyder was a vain attention seeker who craved fame and infamy so bad he's willing to take his own life in order to achieve it, or he was killed by those who witnessed to silence a vocal insider who could talk about aliens and UFOs. And even after all these years, it seems the jury is still out on which one of these scenarios actually is the truth. His widow, however, though estranged from her husband at the time, stood by his claims. She went so far as to suggest intelligence operatives from the FBI and the CIA were seen entering his house and randomly taking things from Snyder's place of residence. Ultimately, she felt there was something nefarious going on in relation to his death, which took place January 17, 1996. You have to ask yourself, how could somebody who needed a catheter have been able to use it to take his own life? It just doesn't make sense. Well, the topic of UFOs is certainly a strange topic, but who would ever thought it would be so dangerous? In fact, that so many delve into the subject, end up missing, sickened, silenced, or even dead seems to indicate that researching UFOs just might be hazardous to your health. Albert K. Bender didn't turn out missing or end up killed, but the manner in which he was silenced is startling enough. Now, he was a true UFO fanatic, but a visit from some MIB scared him straight out of the topic, so much so he spent the rest of his life avoiding that topic. Major Donald Kehoe, in the meantime, knew something was up. Spent a lot of years trying to figure out who was badgering and silencing UFO witnesses and researchers. And he ultimately concluded there was a secret operation of clandestine bullying going on, done by a group of nefarious characters he dubbed the Silence Group. And if it's true, one of the earliest victims of that group of silencers was none other than former U.S. Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. The fact that a man of such status could be targeted simply for speaking his mind is certainly a frightening prospect. Then we have the cases of prominent UFO researchers such as John Mack, Jim Keith, and John Murphy, who all met very odd, unfortunate accidents. Also startling are scientists like Amy Eskridge, who is seemingly on the verge of a major breakthrough in science. Breakthroughs that just might have revolutionized how all of us go about our daily lives, and she suddenly turns up dead. To be absolutely clear, nobody knows exactly what happened to Ms. Eskridge, but if there was some sort of malicious intent behind her death in 2022, certainly this would be a forewarning to others. And for the likes of whistleblowers such as David Grush, the Congressional Record is where you can find his information. To say it's come to his attention during his own career in the military that certain individuals have indeed been targeted and even killed by nefarious actors living deep within the military-industrial complex is certainly something we need to take into account. It's distressing and even disturbing that maybe someday the truth will come out. If disclosures ever come, maybe minds like Amy Eskridge will be able to speak openly and freely without fear of repercussions. But until that point in time, the field of UFO research is certainly a dangerous profession. Now, there is several books that certainly are interesting if you want to follow up on this. There's one by a young man I had the opportunity to meet, Nick Redfern, Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, Suspicious Deaths, Mysterious Murders, Bizarre Disappearances in UFO History. He looks at some of the most shocking deaths and disappearances related to the UFO phenomena. Then we have one by Kevin Randall, who I also know. It's called Crash, When UFOs Fall from the Sky, History of Infamous Incidents, Conspiracies, and Cover-Ups. Then there's the world's greatest UFO and alien encounters. And let's not forget Gray Parker's book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. Certainly it is fascinating when you look thoroughly and closely at the death of some of those involved in the UFO field, such as John Mack. I had the opportunity to talk with him at some length at one book signing I went to. And in spite of being from Harvard, very personal individual who could hold his own in most discussions. To be run down and left on the side of the street. Well, there's been a lot of talk about individuals who get too close to the UFO topic. You have to ask yourself, what gave rise to all the discussions about UFOs? Even though I found reports going back into the 17 and 1800s, it really became a matter of common interest as a result of sightings by a man named Kenneth Arnold. Had an encounter with a definitive squadron of UFOs, June 24th, 1947. He said he hadn't flown more than 2 or 3 minutes on his course when a white flash reflected on his airplane. It startled him. He thought he was too close to another airplane, so he looked and couldn't find where the reflection was coming from until he looked to the left and the north of Mount Rainier, where he observed a chain of 9 peculiar-looking aircraft flying from north to south at about 9,500 feet, going seemingly in a definite direction of about 170 degrees. Now, Mount Rainier is in the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. It's clear to all the craft he crossed paths with were not of any conventional design. He said he thought it was very peculiar. He couldn't find their tails, but assumed they were some type of jets. The more he observed them, the more upset he became. He's accustomed and familiar with most of the objects flying, whether it's close to the ground or at higher altitudes. And this chain of these saucer-like objects was at least 5 miles long. He felt confident after he landed there'd be some explanation of what he saw, but there wasn't. And the flying saucer story was born. As fascinating as story was, there's another case that deserves being discussed, and it predates the events of June 24th by 1947 by almost a year, demonstrating that maybe the so-called modern era of ufology didn't begin with Kenneth Hudnall. Just as fascinating as his report, it's something else as well. It occurred in the Brazilian village of Araraquara and resulted in the death of an individual. The unfortunate victim was João Prestes Ferro, a 44-year-old farmer. It was March 4th, 1946, when his life came to an end. At the time, he was walking to his home in the village, and as he approached the village, who had spent the day fishing in the river, had a feeling we all have one time or another, being watched. Well, it turns out his suspicions were correct. He got home, unable to shake that weird sensation. He looked out the window and suddenly bathed in a bright glow, or his family said it was a beam of some kind that emanated from some form of unknown object hovering in the dark skies above. It was so hot and bright that it forced him to cover his face and drop to the ground. Well, as that beam suddenly went out, he felt the skin grow warm and then hot and then scalding. He staggered around the village, pleading for somebody to help, and those family members that were talked to later remember him exhibiting severe burns to his face and upper body. Well, by the time he was taken to the nearby hospital, his body was decomposing piece by piece, even though he was still alive. That's according to medic R.C. Gomade, who confirmed it in 1974. After hours of agonizing pain, he died, his body having literally melted away in gooey chunks in front of horrified and helpless doctors. It was suspected it was the result of some terrible alien weapon. We'll probably never know, although the reference to the unknown object in the sky is suggestive of a UFO component to the story. But one thing we can say for sure is death was very much an ominous sign of what was to come and what will continue up to the present day. Now let's go to June 21st, 1947, Maury Island, Tacoma, Washington. This case, close to 70 years after it occurred, still provokes major controversy in those circles where flying saucer enthusiasts gather. And that's highly surprising, given that it revolved around nothing less than a malfunctioning UFO that practically exploded in midair. And it led to the controversial deaths of a pair of military personnel and the near death of one of the most famous figures in the history of UFO. On the day in question, a man named Harold Dahl, who was under contract to salvage lumber from the Puget Sound harbor, was out in the waters off Maury Island with half a dozen co-workers, his son, and their pet dog. And suddenly, to their astonishment, they saw in the sky above them at a height of about 2,000 feet a squadron of what would soon become known as flying saucers, all of which had displayed noticeable portholes and hollowed-out centers, close encounters of the donut kind, you might suggest. In total, there were 6 aircraft. It was the specific actions of one of those 6 that caught everybody's attention. As the father, son, and crew stared upward, they couldn't fail to see that one of the vehicles was acting in a decidedly strange way. Like the other saucers, it seemed to be in trouble. And that became even more evident when this thing plunged violently without warning to a height of about 700 feet right above Dahl's boat. At that point, the remaining craft all descended to the same height, and one of them nudged or pushed a malfunctioning flying saucer, something that made Dahl conclude he was attempting to lend some sort of aerial assistance. Whatever assistance it might have been was a little bit too little and a little bit too late. In mere seconds, the stricken craft suddenly exploded, sending a huge amount of material crashing down from the skies. Questions that materially described as falling into two distinct categories. One, a very thin, light-colored material of a metallic nature, and the other, a hot, darkly colored slag-like substance that caused the water to steam. It slammed into Dahl's boat, injured his son, and killed the dog. The dog's death was the first in the Maury Island affair, and unfortunately, there'd be two more to go. Now, a shocked, shaken, and terrified Dahl returned to shore. In no time at all, the story reached the ears of a man named Fred Krishman, who apparently held significant sway and influence over Dahl, and also held a position at the harbor, although it may have been a cover for clandestine intelligence-based work. Indeed, during the Second World War, Krishman worked with the Office of Strategic Services, a forerunner of what ultimately became the Central Intelligence Agency. In the immediate post-war era, Krishman was employed as an investigator for the Department of Veterans Affairs. Now, while the VA would need investigators is anybody's guess, Krishman also had links to the Atomic Energy Commission to the extent that specifically after the Maury Island incident came to a close, he sought full-time employment with the Atomic Energy Commission. Was told of the facts about Dahl, Krishman hastily took steps to examine the strange material for himself. By the time Krishman reached the water's edge, the waves had already deposited a lot of the debris on the shore, and it was just as Dahl had described. Krishman waited no time in scooping up significant portions and hiding it away from any potential prying eyes. And that's when an even stranger series of events unfold that ultimately resulted in disaster and additional death. He proceeded to contact a man named Ray Palmer, the editor of Amazing Stories magazine, somebody with whom Krishman had previously had contact on matters of a paranormal and science fiction nature. By the time that Palmer was apprised of the matter, came to appreciate its potential enormity, the now legendary UFO encounter of American pilot Kenneth Arnold had already taken place. That was seeing the UFOs over Mount Rainier. Palmer, excited and enthused by the story told him by Krishman, engaged Kenneth Arnold and hired him to travel to Maury Island and get into the bottom of the mystery as fast as possible. For his part, with the controversy surrounding the flying saucer mystery spreading all across the U.S., Palmer was hoping when the facts of the Maury Island affair became public, they would increase the sales figures of Amazing Stories. Palmer's transpires is right on the money. Arnold quickly accepted the offer, and after flying from Boise, Idaho, was soon in the Puget Sound, hot on the trail of a malfunctioning UFO, strange and unearthly debris, Dahl and Krishman. When his arrival became apparent to Arnold, then after the immediate aftermath of the strange affair, the strangeness was afoot in and around Maury Island. Seems the entire locale was steeped in paranoia and fear. Dahl's life and those of his entire family had been threatened by what can be described as the Men in Black. There was talk and even a high degree of evidence that many of the players in that story were being subjected to telephone bugging operations, including Arnold himself. And the military was exhibiting far more than a passing interest in what became known as the Maury Island affair. As to how and why the military got involved, when Ray Palmer hired Kenneth Arnold to look into the matter that had gone down, Palmer paid him $200, a significant amount of money in 1947, just to look into a UFO report. While chatting about the Dahl Krishman claims to the office of the Idaho Daily Statesman newspaper, Arnold bragged loudly about how much he was getting paid to chase down the saucer story. And that got the newspaper thinking if the Palmer was willing to shell out $200, there had to be something to it. So the editors of the newspaper sent a telegram to the Air Force A-2 intelligence to tell them what was going on, and the Maury Island mystery entered a new chapter that even involved murder in the air. And on that note, we come to the end of today's show. We'll be back tomorrow and talk more about the Maury Island mystery and other nefarious activities. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show, saying have a truly great evening.